everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, June 17th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about some of the new bills that are in place in Congress and some of the different committees. One in particular would possibly eliminate the employment opportunity going forward for student athletes, so I want to break that down for you all. Then we'll get into some of the consequences of the 12-team playoff on the end of the regular season on conference championship week. Definitely some worries there that I want to get into, definitely break down some different scenarios there. Then we have some breakdown of the possible first-round quarterbacks in this upcoming year. There are a couple of guys that we feel like are relatively cemented, or at least at this very moment are cemented in the first round, but there's plenty of other guys that can make that move and definitely become first-round quarterbacks, so I want to get into a couple of those guys today. Before we get into a recruiting update, definitely a ton to break down with many recruiting visits going on throughout the next couple of weeks, and then we'll finish it off with Monday questions, and we'll get into SEC and Big Ten in the playoff. We'll get into first-year head coaches. We'll get into which head coaches are going to take the biggest leap this upcoming year. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, that's GSMCPodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's start talking about this new bill that is kind of making its way through Congress right now. Members of the House Committee on Education and Workforce voted Thursday along party lines, essentially 23-16, to advance Republican-backed bill dubbed Protect Student Athletes Economic Freedom Act. It's kind of a focused bill on basically barring employment in the college sports space. And this is something that the NCAA has wanted for quite some time. This is something conference leaders are very much behind. So definitely a lot to go on with this. And this is kind of, getting it past, one of the big time hurdles that it has to get past over the next little bit before it's put into effect. But it is getting us closer to some answers in this kind of crazy world that we live in now. But there's a ton of different things that can kind of go on with this going forward. And the question is, do we want employment? Do we not want employment? Is it dangerous for college athletics? Is it not so dangerous? And I think there's a ton of arguments on either side of it, really. I think when you look at employment, especially in other professional sports, it does open up the door for things like, insurance, things, maybe a retirement fund, which sounds crazy for college athletics, I understand, but some of that stuff is a thing that could happen in the future of college sports, and I think that kind of comes a little bit more readily with employment. Not that it necessarily can't come without it, but it definitely, if you input employment, then there are certain things that have to be followed that would make that a little bit easier. Now, with that comes a little bit of money, and as we all know, I think athletic departments are kind of battling right now. They're trying to figure out what the next step forward is, how they kind of move forward from this new reality that they found themselves in. And my biggest thing right now, frankly, and this might change over time, over the next year, 2 years, I don't know, but the reality is right now it's all about just keeping as many college sports intact as possible at as many colleges across the United States. I think that's what everyone's goal is. That's what we all want at the end of the day. So if this is something that would add another bill to the table for these athletic departments and then possibly push them in the direction of cutting some of the smaller sports or cutting funding very aggressively to those smaller sports, then I'm not going to be in favor of that. I'll be totally honest. I think the biggest thing right now is figuring out where you stand after all of this craziness that has just gone on, figuring out how you split up the 22, 20, 18, whatever that number is you come to in your athletic department, figuring out how you're going to split that money among the, women's sports, men's sports, revenue sports, however you want to talk about it. You got to figure out how that works before you jump the next shark, right? Before you get into employment and figure out what all that looks like, which is a totally other can of worms that we can absolutely get into as it kind of gets on through the steps here. It's kind of getting towards the time where we get in front of Congress. I think they still have a couple of steps to get there, but there's a ton that's going to happen with this, and it's going to be a huge topic of conversation for quite some time. Frankly, I think it's going to take a little bit of time for it to get through a lot of the other steps that it has to get through, with an election year, with a lot of different stuff going on. This is not necessarily going to be the top of their list, although I wish it would be, to be totally honest. But at the end of the day, this is going to take a little bit of time to kind of figure out. And obviously, there's going to be some holdups in that time. I know that Charlie Baker and all of the NCAA is really pushing very aggressively to make this happen. So we'll figure out kind of what happens with all of this. But I kind of want to break down the dynamic here for you all. And one of the big things is when you have something like this, you're always going to have debate on two sides, right? You're always going to have groups that form on either side of it. And usually, those groups are pretty distinct. This one is a little bit more gray, at least in one area of this. So you have one side of it that is kind of most, Democrats and most, advocacy group leaders, some different people that are, working with, unions, obviously would be in favor of, having employment and things of that nature. Republican lawmakers, college administrators, many college athletes themselves are on the other side, but also there's college athletes on the side of employment in this. So that's kind of an interesting conversation. Obviously, we'll see how much certain players kind of play into this kind of conversation, because I think they absolutely should. They absolutely should have kind of a say in how this goes forward. But if the majority of players are on one side of this issue, I don't know if it's much of a question, frankly. I assume that most of those athletes are, smaller sport athletes or non-revenue sport athletes, whatever you want to call it, because they kind of need that money more than others, let's be totally honest. So I think there is that a little bit of confusion, I suppose, on the front of which groups are fighting for what and kind of which groups have it, right as of right now. I think there's a lot of confusion about what is right in college football right now. We're trying to figure out what the next step forward is. We're trying to figure out what fits the best, how all of this works. And there's not really a good answer right now. And I think the big thing with, all of this stuff, whether it's revenue sharing or employment or whatever comes down the road, there's going to be some stuff we don't know until it happens. There's going to be some unintended consequences. There's going to be some really tough things that come because of this. But the reality is some of that stuff we won't know until it happens. And I think that's going to be a kind of weird time in the college sports world, but it is all kind of necessary, right? Some of this is going to be trial by error. Some of this is going to be, figuring out what the best way forward is by making a couple of mistakes along the way. And frankly, I'd much rather that than us sit still and try to just let all of this stuff figure itself out, right? So I think at least as long as they're being intentional, as long as they're moving forward and trying to solve some of the issues that are going to, play college sports in the next couple of years, I think we're okay, right? We had one of the big things that we talked about earlier in this segment was possibly losing smaller sports. Jim Phillips even said that if this were to go through, if athletes were to become employees, it could go from 28 sports at a school to 6 in one fiscal year. He said that, and he seemed very confident when he said it. So the reality is it's going to be weird, and there's going to be some things that we have to kind of get through, but the bottom line, bar none, has to happen in all of this. The thing that has to be protected is as many student athletes as possible, right? You have to make sure that there are as many opportunities for men's and women's athletes. It can't just be college football. It can't just be the big time sports. It has to be everyone. And there's going to be incredible amounts of things that have to happen to get us to a place where we all feel comfortable in this new world. But the reality is, we got to feel comfortable before we make that next step. And I fully understand there are a lot of people going in the direction of employment. A lot of people are in favor of it. Many other people are not. So it's kind of a battle that's going to continue to happen. But the reality is, you got to figure out where you stand with revenue sharing before you get to employment. You have to figure out where you stand with the $22 million that you have to split up around the athletic department before you get into maybe another however much money that would be going around to all of these athletes. So it's kind of just a step-by-step basis. It just has to be kind of figure out where we are right now, then we'll make the next step forward, possibly the next step forward if employment is that for college sports, And then, once we figure out where we are for that, we'll take that next step forward. So this is kind of the world that we live in right now with college sports. We've created kind of this world where a lot of the unknown has kind of come to the surface over the last couple of years. A lot of the stuff that we've been a little bit nervous about has kind of come to the surface. And as of right now, I think we just have to figure out where everyone stands. We have to figure out where everyone sits in this kind of new reality, whether it's the SEC and the Big Ten kind of gobbling up everyone else. Is it, maybe everyone is better off than they were before, and maybe we can figure out a way to do this kind of equitably and make sure that all of the teams are compensated fairly and have at least a seat at the table at the very least. So it'll be really interesting to see that all of this unfold. But at the end of the day, I think when you talk about all of the things changing in the NCAA and college sports overall, I think you just have to take it one step at a time. You have to take the one change that just happened, the house settlement and revenue sharing and all of that. Figure all that out. Make sure that it's running as smoothly as possible. Make sure that you're not, putting money where it shouldn't be, or putting too much money in one direction and not in another, or it's not creating a ton of inequities in your athletic department. Make sure all of that is handled, and then we can maybe get into employment. Now, this bill would obviously do away with that chance to get into that later on, but frankly, I'm fully on board with any answers you can give me at this very moment. If this is one of the answers where it's not going to be employment going forward, it's going to be some other type of, way of payment or way of kind of going about things, whether that's collective bargaining or whatever, I'm not exactly sure, but at least that's an answer, right? At least that's kind of a step forward in figuring out what the future is going to look like. And then, the chips will fall where they may. We'll figure out kind of how everything works going forward, but the reality is this would give us yet another answer, and honestly a big time answer about what the future of college sports is going to be, and possibly would keep more sports in on the party in college sports, which is always the end goal. So it'll be really interesting to watch all of this unfold. I'm kind of confused about where I stand on it. As of right now, I'm fully in favor of just keeping everything as simple as possible and trying to get everyone to figure out what the revenue sharing looks like before we get into the next step. But it'll be interesting to see how all of this develops, to see if there's big time pushback that kind of pushes it in the other direction, or this kind of just rolls on through Congress and becomes law here pretty soon. So it'll be really fascinating to watch all that, but we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the consequences of the 12-team playoff. People are worried about the end of the regular season not meaning as much, even some conference championships being a little bit tampered down because maybe it's the same matchup we just saw. So it'll be really interesting to see all of that unfold, but we'll break down all of that and my thoughts on all of it right after this, so stick with us.